Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another Bible study and movie review in Shady Oak Ministries. I'm, of course, Shady Oak, and today we're going to be discussing the recent film Spider-Man Homecoming. This will be the first of what I hope will be many of the Marvel movies that we'll get to take a deeper look into as far as the biblical relevancy therein. But for those of you joining me for this movie specifically, I have to say it's definitely the top positive thing that I would have to say this movie had going for it, and that its plot line directly paralleled a very, very important theme about role models in Scripture. We're going to be talking about a man named David today, and specifically a man named David and his interactions with a man named Saul. Now, as a pastor, I sometimes take for granted the fact that I've read this passage over 50 times and want to be able to communicate it as such to audiences that I assume track with me on this subject. So, for the sake of that not happening, I would like those of you who aren't familiar with the book of 1 Samuel, the Old Testament, and Jewish history, the rise of the first king, and fall thereof as well, of Israel in 1000 BC, I would encourage you to go to FreshLifeChurch.com, where Levi Lusko did a study called Sorry Not Sorry, subtitle Stick a Needle in Your Eye, where he essentially summarized and made excellent applications towards the book of 1 Samuel as a whole, the rise and fall of King Saul, so to speak. And I'm going to do that as well for you here today as briefly as I can. But remember that the focus is going to be on role models, and as well just the outright parallels we saw throughout the book of 1 Samuel to the Spider-Man movie. So if you'd like to know what those were, could you first join me in the book of 1 Samuel? We won't be reading all of the chapters, but I want to read a specific verse that will ultimately give us the key heading for where we are going in this study. David, speaking to Saul, said, "May the Lord repay every man for his righteousness and his faithfulness," referring to a right relationship with God and his ability to be trusted. "For the Lord delivered you into my hand today, but I would not stretch out my hand against the Lord's anointed." Now, I'll explain to you what the context of this conversation is when we get to the end of our story. But before we get to the end, we may as well start at the beginning. 1 Samuel, for all intents and purposes, is a book of transitions. The dating is around 1000 BC in history, and it discusses the life of a man by the name of King Saul, and as well the early introductions to the most famous king of Israel, King David, and it also includes his battle with Goliath, but more on that in a minute. Saul was anointed as the first king of Israel. He was called, he had the crown put on his head, and this was kind of a big deal because being the king of Israel didn't just come with military power and as well the riches and prestige that came with being a monarch in any nation, but it also came with the personal responsibility of stewarding over God's chosen people. He had a lot to live up to. So when he was given this calling, essentially, he treated it like any other human being would, not very seriously, and just accepted the perks without any of the required integrity that came with it. And not once, not twice, but 3 times directly disobeyed the true king of Israel, and that being God. So 3 strikes you're out. Saul was told directly by the prophet Samuel, "You are no longer king of Israel." And during this time as well, in chapter 16 of 1 Samuel, we're also introduced to a man named David, who, like Peter Parker, was given his power, in the most literal sense possible, when he was 15. And during this time period in his life, he was given the calling directly from God. The prophet Samuel came and told him, "You are the future king of Israel," anointed as such, full ceremony, full view of his family. However, was kind of a family secret, much like Peter Parker, and not excluding but limited to the Aunt May secrecy that lasted the full length of this film. It was, for lack of a better reason, kind of common sense that you would keep this thing under wraps, because not only being the king of Israel, just like with being Spider-Man, if he made enemies, they would want to go after his loved ones. Well, in the same way, David being called the king of Israel when the current king of Israel is still on the throne, in the Middle East, that meant that you and your family would be killed. So it's kind of the same conflict. But going even more beyond this, David essentially would spend the next 13 years of his life doing menial tasks such as delivering food to his brothers while they were in battle, tending the sheep, which was not a very high tier job in that day, and just being around the house. So much like Peter Parker, we saw him with all this power, with the reputation of being able to take on Captain America and those that sided with him in Civil War. But just like with David, he had all this power, but kind of just sticking to the small stuff, a friendly neighborhood David in everything that he was asked to do, and ultimately where his influence went. But David was the kind of guy that rolled with those punches and said, you know what? If I'm called by God to be a king, I'm going to be the best king there ever was. If I'm called by God to be a shepherd, I'm going to be the best shepherd there ever was. The side details are negligent to me. I'm going to be the right man at the right time, no matter the situation. So, this was the kind of guy that David was being set up to be, and that's why God chose him over Saul. However, Saul was still on the throne, but God was no longer with him. And when you do something that God hasn't called you to do, most of you at least would probably know that this drains you faster than driving a Hummer with the gas being fuller to the floor. It doesn't last long. And Saul literally drove himself crazy to the point where, just like with Vulture, a sincere calling that was ultimately cut off from him at the beginning because of legitimate reasons. People didn't want people getting their hands on alien technology, for the very reason he became a supervillain. But in the same way with Saul, he had been cut off from the nation of Israel as their king and yet was still on the throne. And that kind of responsibility not only drove him kind of crazy, but it also led to literal murderous tendencies on his point. Just like with Vulture. Rest in peace, Shocker. We will miss you. So all these things being drawn as far as parallels are concerned, Saul's story continues, and when he's having these bipolar moods, they hired a professional musician, the best in the town of Bethlehem that they could possibly find. His name was David. And as he was able to gain influence and be on good terms with the family of Saul, he actually made best friends with Saul's oldest son, Jonathan, who could see the calling that God had on his life, and they became the best of friends. He was his guy in the chair, so to speak. Even more so, and even more interestingly, David was able to eventually gain the affections of, just like with Vulture and Spiderman, the affections of Michal, Saul's daughter. Again, Hebrew, so dude name, girl name, it's details at this point. But time goes on, and then the famous Goliath incident takes place, and suddenly David is famous, and Saul is less famous. So you could imagine his eyes started darting towards him and said, people better start writing songs about me or you're going to be the #1 hit list on the daily mortgage rates. He was just basically off his rocker at this point, and on not one, but 2 separate occasions, Saul went out of his way to chuck a spear at David's head while he was playing music for him to calm him down. Apparently it didn't work, he didn't like the song. Odd way of changing the music tune on Alexa, but I guess that's just how Saul was rolling at this point. David puts 2 and 2 together and understands, I'm not safe here. So with the support of not only his guy in the chair, Jonathan, but also his wife, Michal, who covered for him, he fled into the wilderness where he hid out at a mountain range that was known as En-Gedi, the Valley of the Young Goats. And this place had many different and many various and deep cave locations into it that would not only be able to support David biologically, but would also provide some security for him if Saul ever went hunting for him. And hunting for him he did. Once again, not once, but twice. He gathered an army behind him and tried to kill him. And it was not the first time that Saul, and I'm not mincing details on this, Saul went into the cave to use the faculties of it, and since it's 78 degrees, I believe, round year, in a cave, which is cool during the summer and warm during winter, it was a pleasant place to take a nap. So while Saul was sawing some logs, so to speak, David is in the cave where Saul is at, and most of his friends are there with him. You just see the little beady eyes in the darkness, and they're just like, this guy's been chasing us for 4 years, dude. Kill him. This is from God. And David said, no. he didn't know at the time that Saul was no longer called as king of Israel, so to him, this guy was a king, and he said, I'm not going to lay a hand on the one God has called to be king of Israel. And why was that? Because David's relationship with God mattered ultimately more than anything he could gain on this earth from man. And that ultimately paid off, because when David used this opportunity to at least prove to Saul he wasn't his enemy, he cut off a little piece of his robe, and then when he went out, stretching, getting his faculties back together, David comes up behind him and says, you looking for this? He looks at the hole in his pants and he's just like, I'm an idiot. He realized that David wasn't his enemy, and he said, David, I'm the moron here. We come to an understanding. I tried to kill you. That was wrong. I'm never going to do it again. And he went home along with his army and promised he'd never, ever do that again until he decided to do it again. He hunted him down yet another 4 years later, where once again in a separate cave in En-Gedi, he didn't want to be put in a place where David could sneak up on him at this point. So he arranged his camp where his entire army would be sleeping around him, with him and his chief bodyguard Abner. Draw the parallel to Shocker, but that's stretching it. He was sleeping at the center. And this was not only a move on Saul's part to keep him safe from David sneaking up on him, but it was also because he was in an extremely vulnerable position. Surrounded by valleys and mountains, it would not be unfounded for a team of bandits to be able to ambush Saul and just launch a few arrows into him. He had put himself in a place where he could get himself killed. Sound familiar? Well, David, instead of taking again this opportunity to sneak through the camp, because everyone was dead asleep when they were put at this point. Saul had been pushing them so hard, and God also gave him some support as well. He snuck into the middle of the camp, went up to Saul, took his spear, and walked away. Now, this is interesting, because if you take someone's spear from them, that's generally the point where if this guy has not only promised to not kill you and is now currently attempting to once again try to kill you, this is the 2 strikes you're out, this is strike 3, and that will end this whole matter. But David said, once again, the quotation, in demonstration of his integrity, no. God's called this guy to be king. I'm not going to touch him. God's opinion matters more than anything this guy could ever do to irk me. And so the story went. David took Saul's spear along with his water canteen, and he went outside the camp and then woke everyone up saying, Hey Saul, missing something? I could have killed you, but I didn't. I'm not your enemy. Well, all things considered, this story has a very interesting message to it. Very interesting question to take from it as well. Why didn't David kill Saul when he had the chance? And as well, when he had every reason to. He made himself out to be dangerous, mentally unstable, he was a murderer, and on top of that, he was in the middle of doing something very stupid. David could have just left him alone and he would have gotten himself killed. So why did David spare his life? Well, let's compare this. Maybe we might find an answer to a similar story. In Spiderman, he was given power, but a very long time passed before he actually had the opportunity to use it in substantial and influential ways. He stuck to doing nice things, giving old ladies directions, stopping grand theft bicycle, I believe he phrased it, and on occasion running into the arms deals that included Chitauri weaponry. And you look at all these things and say, okay, that's getting a little bit too much on the danger spectrum. Might want to hand this off to Iron Man, but you want to go for more. And as well, you can read this on your own time. It won't take you more than 2 hours to go through the whole book cover to cover. But 1 Samuel also includes that David wasn't a perfect person. And even when he was put in these kind of situations, he made some serious mistakes. I won't use the term that Tony Stark used to describe it, but the point remains the similarity. The point remains in the similarity. So, not only did Peter continue on with his life during this time of stagnancy, so to speak, he made a lot of friends, including that of the daughter of his enemy, going forward to the comparison to Michael. And finally, when danger situation after danger situation continues to come up, he finally stops Vulture's heist of the Avengers gear, and instead of allowing Vulture in the middle of the heist with damaged jetpack wings deal, instead of letting him fly off, blow up, and burn to death in the wreckage, he goes out of his way. Even though he's tried to kill him on multiple occasions, even though he had no reason and every single right to let him face the consequences of his own insanity, his own murderous tendencies, his own criminal actions against someone who had only been trying to help him. Catch this? He saved his life. He spared his life. He did the right thing when he had basically no reason to, except for right's own sake. Even when he was given the Iron Spider costume, he said, just like with David, even after Saul died, he wouldn't take the throne for another couple years. Spider-Man was given the opportunity to become an Avenger, but he understood, I'm not ready yet. Well, he could have accepted it and received it, much like with David. We see the two parallels, a demonstration not only of integrity, but also of an important basis for where they learned that standard. It was easy to see what the two stories have in common plot-wise. There's a lot of definite borrowing from this original historical document concerning the life of King David and Saul. But beyond the obvious, understand, David and Spider-Man were men of integrity. And I've been using that word a lot. The term integrity means, it's from the term, rather, integer, which is a whole number. It means that you're not lacking in anything in your character, including the ability to do the right thing. And character, for all intents and purposes, it's described as the person you are when no one's watching. When Vulture could get away with something, he would commit a crime. But when Spider-Man could have gotten away with murder, what did he do? He said, I'm not going to take the life of even someone who deserves it. So understand all of these things. What set that logic in both of their heads that would do the right thing, regardless of whether or not it was inconvenient or even unreasonable? It would ultimately end up possibly costing him if Vulture went into prison and Scorpion showed up and asked him, here you know who his loved ones are. Here you know who he is, basically. But what ultimately ingrained that into Spider-Man's head? Well, it was because he had a role model, albeit a flawed one, but a substantial one nonetheless. He wanted to be more like Iron Man. And while that little gray area of what he wouldn't do and not what he would do, but working in that little gray area, that was enough to demonstrate the kind of example that made Peter into the man of integrity that he was. What about David? What made David the kind of man that he was? I mean, I'd take moral life lessons and examples from the Captain America infomercials 6 days a week and twice on Sunday, but we're looking at all this and say, what made David the same kind of man, the same kind of influence upon David's life that Iron Man had on Spider-Man? What kind of example did David have that would make him offer mercy to even his greatest enemy? David's role model was God. This is the book of Romans, chapter 5, verses 6 through 8. For when we were still without strength, in due time Christ died for the ungodly. For scarcely for a righteous man will one die. Yet perhaps for a good man someone would even dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love towards us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. God came to this world and gave his life to save those who still called themselves their enemies. That's you and that's me. So understand the kind of impact that this kind of heart had on David is the same kind of positive influence, albeit minuscule, but impactful nonetheless, that Iron Man had on Spider-Man. And with this kind of moral example, you then have to ask yourself, if Jesus was right in Luke chapter 6 and verse 40, a disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone who is perfectly trained will be like his teacher, ask yourself who you're turning into. Who is your role model? Are you being made more into your own image and likeness? Are you modeling yourself after another human being who is just as flawed and fallen and capable of letting you down as any other person on this planet? Or, as the Bible recommends, Jeremiah 17 verses 5 through 10, don't put your trust in man, but put your trust in God. Because while man may ultimately fail you, while man ultimately is temporary, even on their best day, they're only going to live so long. But God is the source of life. God is the source of every good and perfect gift. And God has offered his internship program freely to you that isn't just a job application or even the opportunity and perks and benefits of getting a multi-million-dollar suit. He offers you a new heart that is made just like his. Thank you for your time and listening to this study. If you have sincere questions, ask them. If you'd like to encourage the ministry, do so. But most importantly, if you know someone who's familiar with this film but not these themes, please share it with them and allow the gospel to go out to our fellow fans of Marvel Studios. Thank you for your time and listening to this study. Remember that Jesus loves you and that he truly is an example and a role model worth following.